Welcome to Open Forum at the MTA International Studios in Silver Spring, Maryland. Today we'll be discussing President Obama's visit to a mosque within the United States for the first time during his presidency. We have two great guests here today. To my right is Salam Bhatti, who's a practicing attorney in New York City. Welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Great. And we have Amjad Mahmood Khan, who is a practicing attorney in Los Angeles, California.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So let's get started.
To everyone here at the Islamic Society of Baltimore, thank you for welcoming me here today. I want to thank Muslim American leaders from across this city and this state, and some who traveled even from out of state to be here. This mosque, like so many in our country, is an all-American story. With interfaith dialogues, you build bridges of understanding with other faith communities, Christians and Jews. There's a health clinic that serves the needy, regardless of their faith. And members of this community are out in the broader community, working for social justice and urban development. As voters, you come here to meet candidates. As one of your members said, just look at the way we live. We are true Americans. So the first thing I want to say is two words that Muslim Americans don't hear often enough, and that is thank you. Thank you for serving your community. Thank you for lifting up the lives of your neighbors and for helping keep us strong and united as one American family. The Muslim American community remains relatively small, so several million people in this country, and as a result, most Americans don't necessarily know, or at least don't know that they know, a Muslim personally. And as a result, many only hear about Muslims and Islam from the news after an act of terrorism, or in distorted media portrayals in TV or film, all of which gives this hugely distorted impression. And since 9/11, but more recently since the attacks in Paris and San Bernardino, you've seen too often people conflating the horrific acts of terrorism with the beliefs of an entire faith. And of course, recently we've heard inexcusable political rhetoric against Muslim Americans that has no place in our country. No surprise then that threats and harassment of Muslim Americans have surged. I just had a chance to meet with some extraordinary Muslim Americans from across the country who are doing all sorts of work. Some of them are doctors, some of them are community leaders, religious leaders. All of them were doing extraordinary work, not just in the Muslim community, but in the American community. And they're proud of their work in business and education and on behalf of social justice and the environment and education. I should point out they were all much younger than me, which is happening more frequently these days. And you couldn't help but be inspired hearing about the extraordinary work that they're doing. But you also could not help but be heartbroken to hear their worries and their anxieties. Some of them are parents, and they talked about how their children were asking, are we going to be forced out of the country? Or are we going to be rounded up? These are children just like mine. And the notion that they would be filled with doubt and questioning their place in this great country of ours, at a time when they've got enough to worry about. It's hard being a teenager already. That's not who we are. We're one American family, and when any part of our family starts to feel separate or second class or targeted, it tears at the very fabric of our nation. It's a challenge to our values, and that means we have much work to do. We've got to tackle this head on. We have to be honest and clear about it, and we have to speak out. for more than 1,000 years, people have been drawn to Islam's message of peace. And the very word itself, Islam, comes from salam, peace. The standard greeting is, Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. And like so many faiths, Islam is rooted in a commitment to compassion and mercy and justice and charity. Whoever wants to enter paradise, the Prophet Muhammad taught, let him treat people the way he would love to be treated. And for Christians like myself, I'm assuming that sounds familiar. Islam has always been part of America. Starting in colonial times, many of the slaves brought here from Africa were Muslim. And even in their bondage, some kept their faith alive. A few even won their freedom and became known to many Americans. And when enshrining the freedom of religion in our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, our founders meant what they said when they said it applied to all religions. You know, back then, Muslims were often called Mohammedans. And Thomas Jefferson explained that the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, he wrote, was designed to protect all faiths. And I'm quoting Thomas Jefferson now, the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan. Jefferson and John Adams had their own copies of the Quran. Benjamin Franklin wrote that even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send a missionary to preach to us, he would find a pulpit at his service. So this is not a new thing. Generations of Muslim Americans helped to build our nation. They were part of the flow of immigrants who became farmers and merchants.
Why don't you frame this for us? Why is it important for a president to visit a mosque? I mean, George Bush visited a mosque, others have visited. Why is it important for President Obama to visit a mosque?
I think it's important for any president to visit a religious house of worship. The United States is a very religiously pluralistic country. It's probably the most unique country in that regard in the world. So it's important for the president to be the president of all people of all faiths or people of no faith. And so he's visited synagogues, he's visited churches. Obviously, there's more of those than mosques. But it's very important that he visited a mosque because in this particular tense climate where there's a lot of Islamophobia and a lot of ignorance about Islam and Muslims, there's an uptick of hate crimes against them. He needed to send a message that Muslims are part of the American family. So visiting a mosque, going to someone's house, their house, as a guest shows that he's, it affirms that.
Okay. So if it's that important, why did he wait 7 years to do it?
You know, we don't know.
Is it too little, too late?
So we don't know why it took him this long, but we are thankful that he did come. You know, for so long, he's invited Muslims to his house. You know, he's had iftar dinners, he's had other types of meetings, and now it's great to see that he's finally come to our house of God.
And that's interesting. So now he came to the mosque and he made a pretty strong speech around Muslims in America, and not you're not Muslim or American, you're Muslim and American was a theme, and he hit it in various ways. His first point was to really thank Muslim Americans for the contributions they made to America. What contributions have Muslim Americans made to America?
Well, there's some obvious examples, right? Athletics, we know, great NBA basketball players, Hakeem Olajuwon, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, great athletes like Muhammad Ali. There's also musicians, the great jazz musician player, Yusuf Lateef, who's also a member of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, and many other such great contributors, Ahmad Jamal, and so there's the music, there's the sports, athletics, there's also science and education and medicine. I mean, American Muslims have been in this country for centuries, and they've contributed just as other great Americans have, and they're an indispensable, inescapable part of the fabric of America.
What do you mean they've been visiting for centuries. From what I understood from the speech, they've only been, the first mosque was not until the late 30s in Iowa, according to his speech.
So a lot of the slaves that came over from Africa were Muslims as well. And there's stories of, like, Kunta Kinte from the Roots. There were stories of him doing prostration, because he brought Islam over. That's what he practiced in Africa, so he was going to keep practicing it here in America.
And in terms of mosques in America, he mentioned the first mosque was in North Dakota and in Iowa. Is that true?
He did say that. I think he had his facts slightly wrong. I think that he said that the first mosque was in North Dakota. Actually, the first mosque, it wasn't a purpose-built mosque, but the first mosque was really in Chicago in 1922, the Sadiq Mosque. And he mentioned Iowa as the longest-standing mosque structure, but that Sadiq Mosque is. But his larger point was simply that it's been a long time that Muslims have been here. In fact, George Washington famously said that he would welcome a Jew, a Christian, and a Muslim to Mount Vernon if they're a hard worker. And Thomas Jefferson, of course, had a Quran. I mean, the history of Islam in America goes back many centuries.
It was interesting how he mentioned he's not the first president to be accused of being a Muslim. Not that it's a bad thing, but he said Thomas Jefferson was accused as well. How he had a Quran? Was he a Muslim?
So Thomas Jefferson had written a religious liberty clause. And from that, in which he back then Muslims referred to as Mohammedans. Yeah. So Mohammedans was referenced. And there were people in his circle who had thought that he had become Muslim. I think his wife even may have accused him in jest that he had become Muslim. And so he said, I'm not the first one. And
so
he's in good
what
company.
Is this thing about, why are people accusing him of being a Muslim? I mean, he made it very clear that he's a Christian.
Right, so it comes down to education. People look at the name Barack Hussein Obama. It's not the most Tom, Dick, and Harry kind of name.
Sure.
Clearly it's an Arabic name or something of the like. So they think Arabic name, they think he's a Muslim. So we need to be able to educate people that you can have different names, but that doesn't mean that just because you sound like you have a Muslim name, it makes you a Muslim.
But what, didn't he have, his father was Muslim?
His father was Muslim, and his upbringing in Indonesia, and the fact is that, and his mother was not Muslim. But I think that there is this otherness with President Obama, half African-American, half Caucasian, Muslim sort of roots with his father. So the otherness plays into this, where I think there are some, unfortunately, who believe that because you're not looking like or sounding like everyone else that was president, that therefore you're not deserving of being president. In fact, the opposite is true. The United States, someone like Barack Obama I always tell people, Barack Obama was not an accident. It's actually a treasure for the United States. If you understand U.S. history, he was meant to be, because the U.S. history is founded upon this incredible melting pot, and it was founded upon religious freedom. I mean, the people fled King George's reign because they wanted to, the Puritans in this country, because they wanted to have religious freedom. Roger Williams founded Rhode Island for religious freedom. Pennsylvania, the Quakers, the whole state was founded because of religious freedom. So I think people have a fear of the otherness, that Barack Obama may be a Muslim. He's clearly not a Muslim. He wasn't born a Muslim, and he wasn't even raised a Muslim. He was raised in a mixed household, and he was ultimately raised and accepted by his own volition, Christianity. And
we've seen a lot of this generation that was brought up during the civil rights movement who hold on to these racist tendencies. So that subtext is perforating throughout this conversation as well. So it'll take another generation or two.
But he seems to understand the Muslim, not only the faith, but also the cultures. I mean, he's lived abroad. He's been to countries like Pakistan, and he's had roommates, I've heard, that are Muslim. I mean, he knows it better than most people.
That's exactly right, and I think that's part of why he's being accused of being a Muslim, is that they say he has a cozy relationship with other individuals. The reality is he's lived a cosmopolitan, life. He has a worldview that's informed by people outside of America. And I think that's a strength, and it's a strength to be an American, is to have that view. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people haven't left America, and they don't know that type of experience is actually formidable.
So now, help me understand. So he gave a speech towards the tail end last year of his presidency, and towards the front end of his presidency, he gave a speech in Cairo. What was that about? These seem like they're bookends. Are they related?
That's a good question. I actually do think they're related. His first speech, one of his first big speeches, was to the Muslim world, and it was a Cairo speech, and it was like a fig leaf to the Islamic world that I am not like my predecessor. I understand the Middle East. I understand the Muslim world. I have a Muslim father, and I understand the scientific heritage and tradition in Islam and the great breakthroughs and discoveries that Muslims have had. This speech was, I've come to a mosque, and in 7 years, I understand, and his message was clear, he actually said this, American Muslims are a part of the American family. And so I am uniquely, I'm paraphrasing here, I'm uniquely situated to understand and sympathize with what you're going through. He actually said that the African Americans in this country, and even Jews early on, and even some Christians, the Irish, many groups are persecuted early on, and there's a lot of hate crimes and hate speech against them. But when people start understanding, they realize that these contributions of these ethnic groups are so remarkable that they actually shape America. So I think that they're related. He actually gave several other speeches in the intervening 7 years as well.
Sure.
And he spoke about after terrorist attacks, he would speak about not associating the acts of terrorism with Islam. Right. So
that's great. So now we're here. He gives this speech, and in this speech, he said lots of nice things about Muslims, clearly. He was addressing Muslim youth in particular, but at the tail end of the speech, he shared 4 principles, guiding principles that he wanted the country to live by. Let's talk about each of those 4 points. The first principle or fundamental, the most fundamental of truths was that we're all God's children, all born equal with inherent dignity. What does that mean? What's he trying to prove here?
He's trying to prove that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, 3 of the core monotheistic faiths within America, have that same ancestry through Prophet Abraham. And I hope it's something that people realize and people can accept.
And does that mean the 3 aren't that far from each other? Because 2 of those 3 seem like they're at odds with the third, which is Islam.
Oh, they're not far from each other at all. In fact, he actually quoted the Quran and the word of the holy book of Islam, and also the sayings of the Prophet. And he said, like for your brother what you like for yourself. You know, these are biblical teachings as well. What he was saying was, at their core, these 3 great monotheistic religions, their scriptures, teach the exact same thing. And it's that common thread that binds humanity. That's wonderful about these faiths. That's what binds the American family as well. And so Muslims have to be a part of the American family because the Prophet taught that they should be looking out and be your brother's keeper, be your sister's keeper, which is in the Bible. It's similar. These teachings are similar in the Quran as well.
Interesting. Okay, so we're all children of Abraham. Whether you're a Christian, you're a Jew, or you're a Muslim, was one of his principles, and that will hopefully lead to what in this country?
A lot more harmony, a lot more reaching out to get to know the other. You know, Pew has reported that 60% of Americans don't know a Muslim. So once we realize that we have common ancestry, common thread, something that we share, we can reach out our own fig branch and say, let's learn about each other.
Okay.
And a common enemy. I think understanding your common friends will make you...
What do you mean a common enemy?
Well, because if you look at the extremists who are perverting Islam, like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, they are killing more Muslims than non-Muslims. So if Muslims are a part of the American family, then the common enemy is the perverted understanding of Islam by some so-called Muslims. So it becomes important to understand your friends from your enemies. And Muslims aren't the enemy within America.
Is that really fair, though, whereas Christians and Jews would say that Islam is flawed because it's creating these folks who are representing Islam and killing? Sure, they're killing Muslims, but they're also killing Christians and Jews, and they're attacking America. So their religion is flawed, right?
Well, if you say 35,000 people of a religion of 1.6 billion people are basically representing the entire faith, then you can say that about Judaism, you can say that about Christianity. I think that argument is flawed because it's very clear that the overwhelming majority of Muslims believe in true Islam, and it's this tiny minority that's cherry-picked parts of Islam for very vicious ends. So I think it's unfair to say that Islam should be typecast that broadly. And in fact, the solution to stop this, you can say a cancer that's spreading within the faith, is to really join the vast majority of people to zero in on that hateful ideology and combat it.
But that hateful ideology they claim, even if it's 35,000 people, is coming from the religion. No? Isn't it coming?
Well, see, that's where their misunderstanding of Islam also comes into play, because what we see is that these ignorant people who are non-Muslim are agreeing with these extremists. So if you're agreeing with extremists on anything, you need to second check yourself.
So is the religion flawed, or are Muslims individuals flawed?
I mean,
it seems like there's a tension.
There's a difference between the religion and the adherents, and I think that, you know, I often say Islam doesn't need reform. We don't believe as Muslims that Islam needs reform, but the behavior of Muslims certainly does. And I think it's not. It's of course they're religious. Members of ISIS are religious. As far as they are understanding religion, they're motivated by something that's grounded in religion. But we know that the French journalist who was held captive for several months by ISIS said he never saw a Quran in the possession of anyone, and they don't even understand their own book. So to say that it's part of Islam is what I take exception to. I agree that they may think it's grounded in religion, but Stalin and Hitler and all of the great despots that the world has seen, they cherry-picked, even Saddam Hussein, you know, to a certain extent, he cherry-picked scripture for their own xenophobic geopolitical aims. And that's not Islamic, that's just them having a gripe.
So, okay, so there's a separation between the two. Okay, so what we learned from this is we're all children of Abraham. All three religions are in essence good, but bad people do bad things and they leverage whatever they can to do it. Is that a way to think about it?
Yeah, there's extremists of all different types out there, and we can't base the rule on these exceptions that exist. Just because a lot of white people owned black people as slaves, does that mean all white people are bad? No, that's not the case at all. It was a lack of education that resulted in that.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's go to second principle now. We have to stay true to our core values, including freedom of religion, which mandates that we reject any politics that target people because of religion. We have to show that America truly protects all faiths. What is the freedom of religion claim that America has made in the Constitution?
Freedom of religion is the first freedom. What I mean by that, the first words of the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights of the United States Constitution, says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. A lot of words there, but basically it means you have the right to practice your faith, and there shall be no establishment of one faith over another faith. It's called disestablishment. So in the United States, it's so unique in the world that you can't have one faith prevailing over the other, and you have to allow every faith to flourish. So what President Obama is tapping into is this incredible, important principle that is central to all Americans. That is, you have to respect the faith of everyone that's living. And it's not just tolerating the faith, it's accepting that their faith is something that they can worship freely. They can propagate their faith freely without any barriers. What they can't do is they can't force that faith on all other Americans. By separating state from church, you're strengthening state and church. That's the American concept.
So, and that is different than Islam, because in Muslim countries they really don't have this, right?
So yeah, there is a merger between religion and state in many Muslim countries, but that is not what Islam says. You know, you have to realize.
But Muslim countries practice Islam, and they don't allow for this.
Well, that's what you're made to believe. Islam is 1,400 years old. These countries are 70 years old, so they're clearly getting something wrong. Islam does not advocate for any specific type of government. Islam says you need to practice absolute justice, and you should engage in mutual consultation. That's about it. That's the parameters it gives. That's the parameters it gives you.
One of the most largest Muslim countries in the world. Take Pakistan. Christians and Jews can't live there freely, and you're saying that Islam promotes this freedom of religious argument there. I mean, the president is promoting in America, but give me the context of the world.
I think that you're right to point out that there's a massive irony that if Islam truly stands for a separation of mosque and state, why don't you see it in practice? The reality is you do see it in practice in certain countries. The most populous country in the world is Indonesia. by and large, it does separate mosque and state. There are some real problems in Indonesia based on faith, a lot of persecuted communities. Pakistan is another example of a tremendous amount of persecution of religious minorities. But those countries are not practicing the teachings and the sayings and everything that the Prophet of Islam stood for. I mean, the Prophet had a charter of Medina that secured the rights of Jews and Christians when he was a minority sovereign, effectively, for 10 years. So if the Charter of Medina, which all Muslims believe, a 1,400-year-old document, calls for religious pluralism, why shouldn't Pakistan? So there's a deviation, and I think it comes from...
How do they justify it?
They justify it because they believe that there is a historic tradition where, you know, Christians and Jews, they're almost perceived as threats, that they can't own property the way we own property. They can't have educational advancement the way we can. They can't impose their views. They're afraid that a Christianity might gain ascendancy or Judaism might gain ascendancy. So because of that, they overreact and they criminalize those activities. It's a terrible, lamentable fact in the Islamic world, and we have to be clear-eyed about the problem, but it's not at its core Islamic to conflate those two.
Great, thank you. This has been Open Forum at the MTA International Studios in Silver Spring, Maryland, where we analyzed President Obama's speech at a mosque in Baltimore, as well as we learned about what he's trying to achieve, and it seems like lots of good has and will come from this speech. Thank you for joining Open Forum.
ما كان محمد أبا أحد من رجالكم ولكن رسول الله وخاتم النبيين.
We hope you've been enjoying today's broadcast. The next program on our schedule is the weekly International Jamaat News Bulletin.